So Yaneer Bar-Yam, our next speaker, is someone I've known not for nearly his whole career, but for many decades, actually. And we've both been sort of doing overlapping but distinct things in the area of complex systems, as well as artificial intelligence of various sorts. So Yaneer, he's a physicist and a systems scientist based in the Boston area. He's the founder and longtime president of New England Complex Systems Institute. And, I would say Yaneer has done more than anybody else I know to promote complex systems modeling and the practical modeling of complex systems, across the board in biology, in molecular and cellular biology, in social systems, in economics, and then to formalize complex systems modeling as a discipline. And agent-based modeling has been a significant part of his work for quite some time, as well as economic modeling. I mean, if you look up his work on modeling the US stock market, like before the financial crisis and after, I mean, this is really classic and deeply insightful stuff. And I would say Yaneer has been almost uniquely effective both at getting the results of simple and incisive models actually listened to and looked at by policymakers, and doing much more in-depth, fine-grained agent-based modeling from a research standpoint, sort of aimed at deeper understanding of the intricate depths of how systems work. So yeah, he was the first person who popped into my head when I thought about pulling together people to brainstorm and present ideas and results regarding agent-based and complex systems modeling of COVID-19. So it's really an honor to have Yaneer here in our digital space, and I will now turn things over to the great Yaneer Bar-Yam.
Thank you for the introduction, and great to be here. And thank you for inviting me. I've tremendous respect. Also, I won't do as big an introduction as you did, but a tremendous respect for the work that you've done, and it's really key contributions in many areas. So let me start by saying that we didn't have to be here. We didn't have to have this disease, which is a terrible disease in the West. It was really possible for us to avoid it. I want to talk about sort of a strategy for thinking about understanding things. And when we understand things, it's really, as someone who's embedded in math, it's about the math, right? But it's really about having the ideas that enable us to use the math to describe the world around us. And the key, as far as I'm concerned, is to really think through why we're writing down mathematical equations. What is the reason? What are the questions that we have? What do we want to know? And embedded in what do we want to know will eventually arise what are the assumptions that we need to use. And I'm going to start up front with something which is really eventually the conclusion, which is there's a difference when we try to understand things from the for purpose of science, for the purpose of academic study, and from the purpose of policy. And the reason is quite transparent when you think about it. When we study things from the point of view of science, lives are not at stake. Whereas when we study things from the policy, and it's very clear in the case of COVID, lives are at stake. And that's true more generally when we think about policy. Policy has real world implications, and we have to think about them in that light. And so let me just give you a very standard academic paper, which is a really great academic paper. He says, here are my assumptions, and ... and here are my conclusions. And that's a really important contribution to make from the point of view of science, because a lot of science is about understanding the implications of assumptions and the conclusions that you can draw from them. But the problem with doing such a paper for the purposes of policy is that the policymakers don't know how to evaluate whether the assumptions are true or not. And so they read the conclusions and they think that that's true. And that's not okay, because if the assumptions are not right, then we're giving them incorrect guidance, and they will make wrong decisions, and the decisions will cost lives. And this has been a problem. This has been a problem in a lot of my interactions with policy and its interactions with science. So I really want to drive that home and say, if you want to do science for policy, the essential responsibility is to check the assumptions. And of course, this is true in general. If you want to do science, you want to know whether the assumptions are correct so that you know whether the conclusions are correct. But in this case, it's an imperative. And I hope that that's clear and transparent. So I want to talk a little bit about the situation with COVID and about the modeling and analysis of COVID in particular. And the first part of it is, how do we construct effective models? And so let me go back to what complex system science is about. Complex system science is about dealing with problems that don't fit in with simple mathematical paradigms, really calculus and statistics, right? Because if we could do it with statistics, why do we need complex system science? If we can do it with the calculus, writing a differential equation, hey, that doesn't require complexity science. And the reason that calculus and statistics are not enough to describe the world is ultimately because of dependencies. Right? If there are dependencies in a system, then the assumptions of statistics break down. Correlations are a terrible way to describe dependencies in general. And of course, the way dependencies give rise to collective behaviors doesn't work in standard calculus, because you end up with sharp transitions like phase transitions and all kinds of stuff that are not correctly described using calculus. And this was understood and clarified in the context of statistical physics of phase transitions, boiling points of water or magnetic transitions. And the reason it showed up is that if you study a phase transition, you end up with incorrect predictions using calculus and statistics, and you need new math in order to overcome it. I'm not going to describe the details. There is an article that I've written to explain the conceptual aspects of it called Why Complexity is Different, that you can easily find online and read about it. But the main conclusion that you come to from this work is not that the math is wrong. It's that the variables are wrong. And so what the real imperative in understanding complex systems is figuring out what the right variables are. And so how does this get manifest? It gets manifest in that when people write down models, they generally think that they have to describe, or in complex systems, there's this perspective that you have to include all the details, right? If we include all the details, then we'll get it right. And the answer is that that's actually not the case, because you may miss some things that are important, and most of the details that you include are actually not the right ones, not the ones that are actually important, or maybe some of them, but not all of them. And besides, it's impossible to describe all the parameters of a highly detailed model and validate it. So what do you do? And the answer is that there is a method that was developed in physics called renormalization group that enables you to identify what are the most important variables in the problem. And once you have what are the most important variables, you put those in, you can validate the model, and you can compare it with the real world, and you can figure out, but if you were right, if you did your analysis right, then it will fit. And if you did your analysis wrong, then it won't fit. And it's impossible to kind of guess what are the right variables so easily. So it's, given gazillion variables, if you write down 3 variables or 5 variables and it agrees, you get agreement with the data, you really know that you understand what's going on. And this is how sort of the reason that I've been working in very different real world problems is that we have this ability to understand what are the variables that are important, and as a result, to clarify for ourselves what we need to pay attention to. And if we can clarify what we need to pay attention to, then we can interact with systems, we can predict things when they're predictable, or not when they're not, right? That's one of the questions that you need to ask. And also you can figure out what the interventions look like that will be effective at achieving some goal. And that's where the policy comes in. So that's the brief introduction to kind of what the math looks like. And one of the things that I tell people is that it's really not about the sophistication of the math that you use. It's really about knowing what the variables are. Because if we get it right, it may or may not be sophisticated, but it's right. So sometimes you get a really simple model, and that's what you need. And any kind of additional sophistication that you add is not what's important. And that's hard for a lot of people to grapple with, because we're very proud of our ability to write down very sophisticated equations and solve them, or whatever it is that we're going to do. So now let's talk about COVID. So the coronavirus that emerged in our world in only a few months ago, right? December-ish, January, it became clear that something was not right. Has three things that we need to know about it. And if we know those three things, it's enough. The first thing that we have to know is that it's a terrible disease. And as a result, we don't want it, right? It's a terrible disease because people get really sick. So there are 80% of people that don't get really sick, but 20% of people get really sick, require hospitalization, they can't breathe, many of them are on ventilators, and a substantial percentage die, right? It's like 5% now. It's even clearer than it was before, even when you do lots of testing. But there's a progression of the disease where mild cases start first, of course, so you don't see that the fatality rate is higher and people get confused about this, but it really is terrible. So that's number one, it's a terrible disease. The second thing that we need to know is that it's fast. And no matter what society you're in around the world, and there's some variation in density, right? So if you live alone in the woods, then it may not get to you. But bottom line, every society in the world, the multiplication rate per time is about a factor of 10 per week. So you start out with a certain number of cases, a week later, it's 10-fold, a week later, it's 100-fold, a week later, it's 1,000-fold. And yeah, it's terrible. It's really fast. And exponential is something that many people, including policymakers, have a hard time understanding, because it's small, it's small, it's small, and then it's overwhelming. So that's the second thing. The third thing that we need to know is that we can stop it. And this has been led to a lot of confusion, because a lot of the people who build models about diseases, including very, very detailed models that have individuals running around in a country doing things that they think are a reasonable representation of what's going on in the country, regardless of the problem of matching math with reality. But regardless of that, the people who build these models generally study flu, because flu is a very bad disease, not nearly as bad as the coronavirus, but it's an endemic disease. So it's around, it comes in cycles, it does all these kinds of things. So the problem is that the whole framework that they're thinking about has to do with these endemic diseases. But this is an outbreak. And as it turns out, I've spent 15 years working on outbreaks, and I'll explain to you why in a moment. But outbreaks can be stopped. And we know how to stop outbreaks. And basically you stop transmission. And if you stop transmission, the multiplicative going up becomes a multiplicative going down, and you get rid of the disease. And we've stopped Ebola a bunch of times. And it's not because Ebola comes in waves, but because there are new introductions of Ebola into a population. And those new introductions of Ebola into a population lead to new outbreaks, but then they're stopped. And SARS was stopped. And there have been other diseases historically that have been stopped. And the point is the following: we can stop a disease if we take the right actions. So if you know three things, number one, it's a terrible disease. Number two, it's really fast. Number three, you can stop it. Then what's the answer? And the policy answer should be unique and very obvious, which is you do all out action in order to stop the disease. And once it's gone, you go on with your normal life. And this has to be the right understanding and should be clear. And unfortunately, there's a huge amount of confusion because of people speculating about one thing, some other thing, and so on. And we lose the clarity about what's really important. So let me take a different step back and talk a little bit about my involvement with pandemics and why I got here, and what it is that, then maybe I'll talk a few words about what it is that we need to do to stop it. And then I'll turn it over to questions. So I got involved in pandemics because we were doing evolutionary biology. And we were studying host pathogen systems, very, very simple models of you have a host and a pathogen, you can call it a prey and a predator, and you have a spatial model because space turns out to be an important, relevant variable. And then you start adding long-range transportation. It turns out that as you add long-range transportation, you go through one of these things that's a complex system, things you go through a phase transition. And you go through a transition that changes the system from having local outbreaks to having global extinction. And it's not just that the disease spreads more rapidly, but that the disease evolves to a more lethal kind of entity because you're not having the selection process that arises from the local extinctions that drives it to being less deadly. So what you end up having is a phase transition at a sharp amount of transportation that goes from local events to global extinction. And that sounds scary, and it is, as people add flights from, I don't know, LA, San Francisco to Sydney, okay? Non-stop flights. So I started talking about this. This paper was written in 2006. And in that paper, we warned about kind of awful things that might happen, like Ebola and SARS-like diseases. Does that sound familiar? And in 2014, I hadn't gotten much traction in warning. So this is already a long time later, 8 years. And I spoke at the WHO in Geneva, and I told them about this as part of a larger talk. It was a 5-minute segment, and their jaws dropped. And why do people's jaws drop when they hear that things are getting worse? Because they have a statistical frame of thinking about the world. And in statistics, past events are predictive of future events. And they're not. So, and in particular, they're not if you're going towards a transition where dramatic changes are going to take place. So they were very respectful of our work, to be fair, but they didn't do anything, and Ebola started in West Africa in 2014. It was the worst by a factor of 10 from any other outbreak before. It ended up with 10,000 people who died, about 20,000 cases. And it was involved in 3 countries, and it got to the United States a little bit, and there was all of this politics about it, but there are a few things that are important to understand. The predictions, the modeling predictions about what would happen in Ebola in West Africa were burnout. They also assumed that it wouldn't get anywhere else, which didn't make any sense. But the fact that it was going to go to burnout was predicted by the models. Burnout would have been 10 million people dead. Remember, there was only 10,000 people dead, 0.1%. So what stopped it? Well, what stopped it was something that I couldn't get my academic colleagues to accept. And that was that behavior change was possible. So I was advocating a shift in the dynamics of disease prevention. What do you do about it? And what did people do about it as a standard way of doing things is called contact tracing, which is a super powerful and really important way to stop diseases. And that is someone shows up in a doctor's office in a hospital, they're sick, and you treat them, but you also ask them, who did they touch? And you go back into the community, you find the cases, and you isolate them. Very good. It stops transmission of cases for those people that you isolated. The problem is, what do you do if you're in Monrovia in Liberia, or a major city like New York, and you have 10 or 20 or 30 cases? How are you going to find all of the people that this person touched in the subways, in the, whatever? It's just not going to happen, right? So what is the answer? And the answer turns out, in complex systems language, you think in scale. You cannot address the problem at the individual level anymore. You have to address it at the next scale up, which is the community level. So instead of waiting for someone to show up in the hospital, you go back into the community, and the community does monitoring. Whether you send people in from the outside, it turns out that the best way to do this, and the way they did it, is the neighborhood people went around the community, checked everyone for fever a couple of times a day, and isolated anybody that had a temperature. It's more people than have Ebola, because not everyone that has temperature has Ebola, but that's okay, you stop the disease. So the disease went up exponentially, and then went down exponentially and was gone. 10,000 instead of 10 million. Really important way to think about things. Now, the point about this is that we did simulations of this, and we got really a good agreement. You can look for the paper. It's called Beyond Contact Tracing. It's on our website at the New England Complex Systems Institute. You can find it there. And you see that the data matches. Great. It's the only strategy that really has the chance of working in this kind of context. And why didn't my academic colleagues believe it? Because they said, people won't do this. You think sitting in your office that people will do this, but I know, they would tell me, that no way people are going to change what they're doing in order to stop this outbreak. So it's going to go to burnout. Now, how do they know? And that's a real problem, because this is the same problem that we've had with much of the modeling that's been done on the coronavirus. Because there are people who sit, who think that they know what people will do and won't do. And they make a list. Let's look at this thing that we do. Let's look at this thing that we do, this thing, this thing we do. And they make estimates. Well, what is going to be the compliance? And how are people going to do this? And are they really going to do this or not going to do this? And so on. And how do they know? And so I think that that's really poor use of modeling. I think the purpose of modeling in this context is to answer a question. Is what do we have to do in order to stop the outbreak? And more than that, what do we have to do in order to stop the outbreak as fast as possible? Because then we can return to normal, which is what everybody wants. So this is kind of the difference in different kinds of models. So we have a piece that we've written about several pieces that we've written about modeling in the context of the coronavirus outbreak. And one of them, let me see if I can give you the name of it. So if you go to the NEC, the New England Complex Systems Institute, there's a banner called Stopping the Coronavirus Pandemics. And down under analyses, there are a few pieces. One is eliminate VID 19, a community-based analysis. That's really important because it talks about not just individual to individual transmission, but community to community transmission. And then there's another piece called What Models Can and Cannot Tell Us About COVID-19. And again, the crucial thing is, how do we think about two kinds of things? What is it that we know and can put into models? And what is it that we want to know or need to know in the context of policy? And so one of the things that we need to know is, can we stop it? And the answer is yes. And if we can stop it, then a key thing is to understand what it is that we need to do in order to stop it. How can we stop it as fast as possible? And we have a bunch of recommendations. And some of the recommendations are, standard ones that people are accepting. And some of them are things that people are not doing and they should be doing. But it's only a short list. It's like 9 things. And 2 of which are not really about stopping it, but about, making sure people are healthy or treating them. So let's say there are 7 things that we need to do in order to stop the outbreak. And that's kind of enough. So let me stop there. If you want to see the recommendations, you can go to there's a new website. So what happened is that at the end of January 26th, I put out a short paper saying, it's a 1-pager, right? Saying, this is important. We got to do something about it. We got to stop this. And some people listened and some people didn't, but they didn't stop it. And then about 2 months ago, when I saw that the West wasn't going to take kind of the right action and prevent it from getting to the West, because they were worried about stopping flights. You know, hey, it's a really high cost. You know, if you stop a few flights from coming to the United States or to Europe, that's so bad economically. Why would we want to do that, right? That was kind of the logic back then. And that's kind of been the logic all along, right? We can't do this because X. And then a week later, oh, I guess we can do this when we get overwhelmed by the outbreak. So we can do a lot of things. People can do a lot of things. It's really a question of whether they choose to do it. And in the meantime, there are countries that have chosen to do everything that's needed, and now they don't have the coronavirus. And that's a really good thing. So we're starting to have success, but there are a lot of places that are still not doing it. In any case, there is a piece that is called How to Win. What I didn't finish is that 2 months ago, I sent out a call for volunteers because it was overwhelming to try to address this from the point of view of social decision-making. And we ended up now with, I don't know, something like 8,000 volunteers, of which almost 5,000 are on Slack channel. And hopefully at some point, we will stop this completely. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Yaneer. Really mesmerizing talk. Thanks a lot for sharing your knowledge with us. And again, we have a great community of people watching the live stream, and many of them has asked some very interesting questions. So I'm going to start with the first one from Makita, and then there are a couple more that I'd really like to take and to ask you. So Makita is asking, what do you think of the herd immunity idea? And in other words, should we lock down or let the wave of virus pass through the population to develop herd immunity?
So my attitude about herd immunity is that it's kind of a scientism kind of thing. It's like you say some words and it sounds like it might have to do with science, but it really has nothing to do with science. It's just the idea that let's just let the disease kill people. Because the number of people that disease kills is about 5% of the population. Why would we want to do that? And 20% of the people have to be in hospitals. And if you don't have hospital capacity, then it's about 10% more, probably 12%, 15% to die because they don't have the hospital care they need. So why would we want to do that? And the second point is that actually it's not even clear that you get immunity from doing that. This disease is different from the ones that you're familiar with. It doesn't live in the body, it lives in the lungs. The immune system is not in the lungs. It's in the air in the lungs, it's on the surface of the lungs. And as far as we know, as far as I understand it, there's no coronavirus that has a vaccination. So you can have immune system response in your nose that will reduce maybe your likelihood of being infected. But there's no real immunity from this disease. So all of this discussion is based upon kind of concepts that are both dispassionate. They don't care about the fact that we're killing a lot of people. And it's not a hard calculation. And also are not understanding the basic biology of this disease. So I don't see any merits to the idea of herd immunity. It somehow became this mantra that sounds like it has to do with epidemiology. I mean, herd immunity is for when you do vaccinations, when people are not hurt by what you're doing. It's not about letting a virus run rampant, because if you let the virus run rampant, you've kind of defeated your whole strategy, right? You're just letting it happen, which was not the point. Otherwise, you don't do anything, right? What is the difference between herd immunity and not doing anything? Nothing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. So we have another question from Ilir Siraj, hope I pronounced the name right. He's asking, what do you think about scaling effects on the dynamics of the disease, and how much can you explain infectivity, lethality differences between countries due to population size?
So the scaling with population size. So scaling with population size doesn't matter until something becomes endemic. right? Because imagine you have an outbreak in a certain local area in a country. Well, how big an area do you include in the calculation of the population of the relative, all the data relative to the population size? Right, so there's no, I mean, so you think about an outbreak as an outbreak. And all of the outbreaks in the world today are only down at even the ones that are severe are at the 1% level. So you haven't seen anything yet in terms of the severity of this disease if it ran rampant. What's unfortunate is that people waited until hospitals were overloaded before they reacted. But we could have stopped it a lot smaller. In some places they did. So there's a great example, if you want to look, I mean, maybe people can look online. There's a example of the difference between Greece and Spain. Is there any way I can share my screen, right?
Yes, you can.
So let me pull up a figure for you. Let's see, share screen. There. So can you see this figure?
Yes, we can.
Great.
Thank you.
So here are, so Italy was the entry point into Europe of the disease. And it spread into Europe from there. And so there are two countries, right, on both sides of Italy. One is Spain and the other one is Greece. So there shouldn't be really any difference in the outbreak in Spain and Greece, except that there is. So let me show you, this blue curve is Greece. And this orange curve, orangish curve, is Spain. And this is on the same axis, right? Despite the coloring, it's on the same axis. And this is logarithmic axis. So this is 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. And these are cases per day. So you see that Greece had a lot fewer cases than Spain. And the reason, if you look at it, is that they acted earlier. So here they did international flight suspension. Here, this is the border control over here. So roughly, I mean, there's, things are actually fairly parallel in the actions. There are some slight differences, but really not to first order. But in each case, the actions in Greece happened 2 weeks earlier than the actions in Spain to limit the outbreak. And notice that Spain has a factor of 100 larger in cases. And that's exactly what I said. You wait a week, you have a factor of 10. You wait 2 weeks, you have a factor of 100. So here it is. You can see it in this data, and it's very transparent. It has nothing to do with the population of Spain or Greece, because all of these outbreaks are much smaller in size, right? This is 10,000 per day. That's a lot of people getting sick and a lot of people dying, but it's still small compared to the population. And maybe it's also helpful for me to show, I mentioned it, it's also helpful for me to show kind of the countries that have been successful. And I have a new figure, which is going to be put on our website, but it's not up yet. I didn't mention that the website name of the website that that has been created. Where do I have it? Just a second, let me find it. Is called endcoronavirus.org, endcoronavirus.org. And here we go. There it is. Bring your shared window to the front. Can you see this one now? Sharing is paused. Hang on a moment. Let me do stop share and I'll do start share again.
Yeah, thank you.
There it is. So can you see this one now?
I think we can see a portion of it. Unless it's my screen that has some issues, but it looks like we can only see a portion of your screen.
Yeah, it's somehow not outlined. Let me just try to share the screen as a whole.
Exactly. Yeah, now it works. Now we can see
You
it.
see it?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so these are countries that have been successful, among the countries that have been successful in stopping the outbreak. So, for example, South Korea, boom. Here's Greece, boom. Jordan almost didn't have cases because they did a really, really strong lockdown. Iceland, boom. Luxembourg, boom. Croatia, boom, and so on. So New Zealand and Australia are among them, and they have it easier because they're islands. But it's clearly not just islands that can do this. But understanding the travel restrictions are a key part of this is really important. If you look at the steps that people have taken, implementing travel restrictions is key, because otherwise, how are you going to stop it? If you allow sort of, how do you drain a bathtub without stopping the water from coming in? Yeah. But more and more countries are doing this. And let me see if I can find a figure here. There it is. So this is kind of a country by country plot showing the relative number of cases relative to the peak. Can you see it?
Yes. Is this supposed to be? Yes, we can see it. Perfect.
So this is China up at the top. And of course, China had the outbreak and then it squashed it. Okay, so no cases. And there are a few cases, but they're imported right here, so that they're quarantined. Here's South Korea, squashed. Here's Iceland, doing good job, right? Then Australia, then Austria, and here's New Zealand. Now, New Zealand has declared that they no longer have community transmission. So they've moved from level 4 isolation to level 3 isolation, and they're, hopefully going to be progressing further. There's Thailand. There's France is, kind of crazy. Their data is not very good, so I wouldn't take this seriously. And Switzerland is doing okay. Luxembourg is doing okay. Slovenia and so on. Serbia, Estonia. And then you go down here and you see, hey, we're down here. This is the United States. Now, again, it only takes 5 weeks to stop this outbreak. So everyone should know this. Why does it take 5 weeks? Because there's a 2-week incubation period. And with a 2-week incubation period, after 2 weeks, if you do it right, you know everybody that's sick. And then you only have kind of transmission of within families. I'm assuming you're not isolating people individually, but sort of within homes. Then you have transmission within families. So then you know everyone else who's sick, basically. And so after 4 weeks, you're kind of done with the disease. And it takes a little longer because of leakage. So about 5 weeks. So everywhere in the world, if they took it seriously, they could eliminate this disease in basically 5 weeks, say 4 to 6 weeks. Because the time is not dependent upon the area, it's not dependent on the population, it's just dependent upon the disease process itself once you lock down places and you do the right things. And the question is, are you doing the right things? And the United States has been in a lockdown already for much longer than that in most of the states where the outbreak is taking place, which is almost everywhere, right? And we haven't gotten rid of it yet. And people are exhausted, right? Everyone's exhausted. This is kind of, how long is this going to last? Let's start opening up. I really want to get back to normal. And so everyone's starting to say, okay, let's start going back to normal. But of course, the right answer is, if we eliminate the disease, then we can really go back to normal. We'll never go back to normal if we don't eliminate the disease. Because remember, what's happening now is just 1% of the population. And if you let the disease run through the population, you're going to have 5% dead, actually more like 15% dead, because you don't have hospital capacity. So trying to keep it down at about 1 right? You know, a reproduction rate of 1 and not growing exponentially is a huge effort, right? We've been doing it for weeks and we've gotten basically 1. New York is, by the way, doing better. They're down to 1/4 of their peak at this point. So if you look at New York, I have a figure also of states. You can see what's happening in terms of states. So this is states. And you can see that at the state level, this is a few days ago, so there's some changes. So I don't want to go into it in detail, but like Montana, Hawaii, Idaho, Wyoming, you know, they're doing well. Of course, North Dakota was doing well until they had an outbreak because they didn't prevent people from coming in and starting an outbreak. But, you know, in the meantime, there are some states that are doing pretty well, right? They're down. And if you look, here's New York. So New York is within the top, I don't know, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 12. It's down to 1/4 of peak at this point. That's huge because New York has had the largest outbreak in terms of numbers. And it has the most dense population. So you'd think it's the hardest to do it there. But they're being successful. So why aren't all of these places being successful? And the answer is because they're not taking it seriously enough. They think that if you do a lockdown, you do a lockdown, you do a lockdown, and the same thing that happened in China will happen. And if it didn't happen, maybe there's something wrong with the lockdown idea. So we should go to herd immunity or something, or just open up. But it's not the case. The worst thing that you can do when you have a lockdown is send people home to their families if they have the disease, which is what we're doing. Right? Because 80% of transmission is within families. It's totally nuts to send people at home to isolate in their families. And maybe it's okay if you have 2 wings and 2 bathrooms, or maybe it's even okay if you have a bedroom and a bathroom and you don't have to go into public spaces. But even that is kind of iffy. But surely in apartments with 1 bathroom to prevent the transmission is just not possible. So all we're doing right now is we're cutting off some of the transmission, but we're not cutting out a lot of the transmission that's happening. And another thing that we're doing is we're not just sending people home to their families to infect their families, which is totally crazy. But we're also sending people in nursing homes back to nursing homes to isolate in nursing homes. And so what are we ending up with? We're ending up with catastrophic situations in nursing homes. Just look it up. And a lot of the cases, in some places, 50% of cases are in nursing homes. So we're just doing the wrong things. And the reason is that we're not taking this seriously. And this is a terrible disease. It's an incredible opponent. It's like we're wrestling this opponent. One of the great stories about this outbreak is that there's a mixed martial artist in Ireland who's world famous because of his abilities. And he stood up and said to the people in Ireland, we've got to take this on. We've got to do this and do it all out. And this is what I have to tell everybody. This is what I'm trying to tell everybody, that this is an incredibly severe and serious opponent. And we don't get around it by being clever. This is not about being clever. This is about a straight path. There are a few things that we need to do, and if we do them all out, we get rid of it. And thinking about all the subtle details about, you know, people are talking about oscillating the lockdown, or talking about maybe if we do a little bit of this cleverly or that cleverly. The people who are on this call are incredibly clever, incredibly smart. This is not about that. This is about a will to do it all out and to get it done. There are some problems that they are amenable to being clever. And this is not one of them. It's obvious what we have to do. We just have to stop transmission. And if you think about what's needed to stop transmission, it's a small set of things. It's going all out, having everyone on board to do it. It's the social distancing and taking it really seriously. It's making sure that people wear masks. It's doing testing. And by the way, one of the things that we're not doing, which is a little bit clever and we're not doing, is using CT scans instead of PCR tests, because PCR tests have 30% false negative rates. But CT scans have about 1% or 2% or something like that false negative rates. And they're available and you can do them immediately and you get the results as soon as you do them. So it's a super better, and China used it. And other countries are using it. The United States is not using it. Why? I don't know. It has to do with some bureaucratic process of changing policies because it's not what is normally done, honestly. So we should be using CT scans all over the country in order to detect cases early and stop the disease. And we're just not doing it. So, so that's another one. And then there are a few more, like making sure that essential services are safe, employers take care of employees, and you know, so that they don't get infected, so that they have masks and gloves and so on, and they don't affect people that are coming to stores. Don't go into stores, get delivery, do a curbside pickup. Don't take risks. We don't need it. And then there are a few things like making sure people take care of their health, which is a good thing to do, and that we take care of the healthcare system so that people don't die in hospitals more than they absolutely have to. And those are kind of the things that we need to worry about. One of them, by the way, is travel restrictions. And let me talk about it because it's super controversial for some reason. We can't shut down flights because, hey, the global economy will crash and burn, you know, and so on, something like that. And we couldn't stop the disease from coming to the United States or coming to Europe because we can't stop travel. I'm sorry, guys. It's just really not the right way to think about it. Stop the travel, prevent the disease, drive the disease to extinction, and then open up travel. We'll live. Instead, we have this disease that's all over the place, including everywhere in the United States. You go to your state and look at the disease spread in a state. Why did we have to let it get everywhere? Use travel restrictions. China, the lockdown was not about social distancing. It was about preventing the disease from getting out of Wuhan for the rest of China. Let me show one more picture since it's, so let me show you the website that we created. So this is the endcoronavirus.org website. And there's a piece, actually don't know here. So there's a whole bunch of pieces that we've written. But I want to show you the situation in China.
Thanks, Yaneer. I'm just conscious that we have Robin waiting for his next talk. So
all right, let me just do this quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I don't know it. So look for a piece called Why 5 Weeks. And it has a picture of what happened in China. And the outbreak was really in Wuhan and extended to a few other places, but not nearly as much. And that's because they stopped people from traveling to other places. Let's say we want to open up this country, or we want to open up a state, and we've done all the work to eliminate the virus in that state. Or maybe it's in a city, or maybe it's in a town, and there are no cases there. How are we going to ever be able to open up if we allow anybody in to start a new outbreak? So travel restrictions are actually the first. Remember I talked at the beginning about relevant variables in physics? Well, if you didn't have travel, you wouldn't have a pandemic. So it's clearly a relevant variable. And if you leave the control of that variable out of your equations and out of your policies, you know, hey, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to stop it. So use them.
Thank you so much, Yaneer. A truly mesmerizing talk. We had a large number of questions coming from the community, but unfortunately, as I said, we don't have time right now, as I'm conscious that Robin is waiting for his talk. Myself, I would have loved to use the privilege to ask you some questions about my country, which is Italy, of course, but that would have taken ages and probably just a conference.
Let me just say, Italy is doing a good job, but it's slow.
That's a very long story. Yeah, that's been for many years.
And understanding why it's slow, it's 0.98 multiplier for a month. So I can show you the picture of the geography and so on. They're beginning to clear some areas. They're getting to green areas, which is really powerful and important. But it took way too long. And I don't know exactly why, but I have some guesses. because I don't understand all the policies there.
Italian politics is its own topic. That's right.
Exactly.
But they're being successful, and I think they won't go back. I think they won't go back. I think they're going to clear the disease and they're going to go to normal, which is really powerful and good for them.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Yaneer. And yeah, I would encourage anyone who's curious to dig in more detail. You can look into the research Yaneer and his group have published. The paper Beyond Contact Tracing is one I think he mentioned, which I remember from a while ago, which showed policies that tamped down the epidemic in Africa, where there just wasn't technology to do contact tracing. And there's a lot of history there of effective agent-based modeling, in some cases just reinforcing the value of very simple but effective policies.